Greetings and welcome to Master Chess Theater. In today's episode, we will look at a game that never gets old. In fact, our feature game is known as the Evergreen Game in reference to plants that remain fresh or green, as this game has since it was played in 1852. Karl Ernst Adolf Andersen was born in Breslau, Prussia, in what would now be Poland, in 1818. When Andersen was 9 years old, his father taught him how to play chess. As a boy, Adolf Andersen learned advanced chess strategy from studying William Lewis's chess book, 50 Games Between Le Bourdonnais and MacDonald, which at the time were regarded as the greatest chess games ever played. Shortly afterwards, still during his youth, Adolf Andersen's father died, and the young Andersen pursued a career in mathematics and was able to earn enough teaching university math courses to support his widowed mother and unmarried sister. Andersen's growth as a chess player was slower than other great players, largely because he couldn't spare the time away from his math work to focus on chess. However, during his tenure as a professor, Adolf Andersen did find time to publish chess articles, which attracted the attention of the strongest chess players in Berlin, Germany. After impressing the players in Berlin with his creative attacking style, he was appointed the editor of the first German chess magazine, Schachzeitung der Berliner Schachgesellschaft. Soon, the humble mathematics professor was playing chess matches against the Baron von der Lasa, Daniel Horowitz, and other great masters of the time. This, in turn, earned him an invitation to represent Germany at the first international chess tournament held in London in 1851. Adolf Andersen worked diligently to prepare for the 1851 London International Tournament, and the extra study and practice against first-rate opponents had a dramatic effect on his overall ability. At the tournament, Andersen triumphed over the best chess players in Europe and was awarded a large sum of money for his first-place finish. With his newly earned wealth, Adolf Andersen continued to dominate the chess scene for several years until Paul Morphy arrived. In December of 1858, Andersen traveled to Paris to challenge Paul Morphy in match play. When Adolf Andersen arrived, he was greatly surprised to see that Paul Morphy was gravely ill. Paul Morphy was confined to his hotel room, suffering from a severe case of influenza. The doctors were treating him with leeches and bloodletting, which further weakened Morphy. At first, Andersen wanted to call the match off, but the gravely ill Morphy insisted that the match should take place. So despite Morphy being too weak to stand from his bed, the two strongest chess players in the world decided to play a chess match, as this encounter would likely be their only opportunity to determine who is the best chess player in the world. No money was at stake, only honor. Adolf Andersen outplayed the American early on, but ended up losing the match by a score of 8-3. While most chess scholars agree that Morphy was the stronger player, one has to wonder if the kind-hearted Andersen was able to play his best chess against an opponent whom he feared may die. Regardless, Morphy won the match, regained his health, returned to America, and retired from chess, so Adolf Andersen was again considered to be the strongest chess player alive until Wilhelm Steinitz defeated him in their famous 1866 match. Jean Dufresne was a wealthy student of Adolf Andersen who lived and died in Berlin, Germany. Dufresne, who won notable victories over Karl Mayet and Daniel Horowitz, authored Kleines Lehrbuch des Schachspiels, which was the go-to chess book for countless generations of German-speaking chess students. However, arguably his most famous contribution to chess was an 1852 loss to his mentor, Adolf Andersen, known as the Evergreen Game. And now that we know more about the participants in the Evergreen Game, let's take a look at the game itself. The Evergreen Game. played in Berlin, Germany in 1852 between Adolf Anderssen and his student Jean Dufresne. Anderssen starts off with 1e4, putting a pawn in the center, and Jean Dufresne responds with 1e5. 2, knight f3, developing a knight. 2, knight c6, developing a knight and defending the center pawn. 3, bishop c4, the Italian structure. 3, bishop c5, so there won't be a fried liver today. 4, b4. This is the Evans Gambit. It's an aggressive choice named after the Welsh sea captain William Davies Evans. Here, white gladly offers a pawn, so he or she can open up the center and develop faster than in the Yoko piano by not having to spend a tempo on playing pawn to c3. In fact, let me just show you the mainline Yoko piano. That goes e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and then pawn to c3, preparing pawn to d4, which gives black time to play knight f6, and then white can play d4. So white has 2 pawns side by side, the ideal pawn center, but 2 pieces developed. Black only has 1 center pawn, but 3 pieces developed. Again, this is the mainline Yoko piano, and it is also an excellent choice by white. However, Adolf Anderssen plays the aggressive 4b4, aka the Evans Gambit, instead of the slow preparatory pawn to c3. Jean Dufresne plays 4, bishop takes b4. Although I recommend accepting the gambit in this fashion, black can also choose to decline it, and I will include information about how to decline the gambit in my notes to this game on dailychessmusings.com. So be sure to check that out. Adolf Anderssen plays 5c3, attacking black's bishop again while preparing to play d4. 5, bishop a5. This retreat makes sense for black as his bishop remains on the same diagonal as white's king, so to exert pressure on c3 after white plays d4. Of course, white must also be prepared for black to play 5 bishop c5 or 5 bishop e7. And again, I am including extensive notes on both of those moves in this game posted on dailychessmusings.com. So just go to dailychessmusings.com and search for the Evergreen Game to find the lesson, and you can peruse through those notes at your convenience. Adolf Anderssen plays 6d4. A wise old man once said of the opening, always play to gain control of the center. Jean Dufresne responds with 6 exd4. Cracking the center open may be playing into white's plans, so the main alternative here for black would be to support e5 with 6d6. Let's take a look at that. If 6d6, white can play queen b3, threatening the weak f7 belly button twice. Queen d7, so of course black can add a defender. Dx e5, bishop b6, knight b to d2, knight a5. Black exploits one of the main drawbacks to the queen b3 and bishop c4 scheme by forking the 2 pieces with knight a5. Queen b4, saving the queen. Knight takes c4. So black has successfully gotten rid of white's Italian bishop. Knight takes c4. Bishop c5, hanging on to the bishop pair while threatening the queen. Queen goes back to b3, to which black can play knight e7, clearing the path for castling. 13 castle, castle. 14 exd6, cxd6. 15 bishop a3, unifying the rooks and threatening to get rid of black's bishop pair. Queen c7, knight d4, bishop takes a3, knight takes a3, knight c6, rook f to e1, queen goes to e7, rook a to b1. So both of white's rooks are very active. Can't say the same for black. Knight to e5, pawn to c4, a6, stopping any of white's dreams of a knight b5. So knight a to c2, bishop e6, knight e3, and then b5, which adds pressure to the pinned pawn on c4. And 23, knight d5, gets rid of the pin while simultaneously threatening black's queen. So bishop takes d5, cx d5, and white has a moderate advantage with extra space and piece activity. Queen f6, knight c6, rook f to e8, rook bc1, g6, h3, stopping any ideas of black's knight going to g4. h5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, rook advances to c6. So the queen gets off the 6th rank and forms a battery in the e-file, attacking e4 twice. f3 to support e4. g5, obviously threatening pawn to g4. Queen goes to b4, and now white is ganging up on the d6 pawn. So rook d8, which, unfortunately for black, leaves a6 undefended. Rook takes a6. f5. And in this game, black is going all out with the kingside attack. Always fun when you see these rare instances of pawn storms where both players are castled on the same side of the board. Queen a5, fx e4, rook a7, rook to the 7th rank, attacking the queen. Rook d7 interposes, trades rooks, fx e4, g4, there's g4, we talked about that coming, hx g4, hx g4. I'm getting a little carried away with this analysis, so I'll go a little faster. Queen c3, queen a7 check, queen e3, queen trade, king f7, king f2, king f6, rook e2, good endgame stuff, rook e8, getting the king active, king e3, g3, king goes to f4, rook to a8, rook b2, rook a5, a3, rook takes a3, rook takes b5, rook a2, rook b6, rook takes g2, rook takes d6, king f7, king f3, rook g1, and 51, rook e6 was the final move. Because after g2, then white can play king f2, black's rook must move, and the black pawn will fall. In Nigel Short's victory over Robert Hübner, played in Dortmund, Germany in 1997. Additionally, I will place one or two other games in the notes of this game, the Evergreen Game, at dailychessmusings.com. Now, back to the Evergreen Game. So I got off on that tangent to show you an alternative to playing 6exd4. In this situation. Certainly there's nothing wrong with playing 6exd4, but now you know that supporting your e5 pawn with 6d6 is also a possibility. But in our game, Jean Dufresne plays 6exd4, and Adolf Anderssen plays 7 castle. Castling out of the pin is the obvious plan for white. 7d3, a clever push that has the intended consequence of leaving the c3 square unavailable for white's knight and making it so white cannot achieve the ideal pawn center by recapturing with cxd4. Here, 7 knight g to e7 should also be strongly considered as it creates that path toward castling. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't show you 7dxc3, since the move 7dxc3 was punished spectacularly by Bobby Fischer in Fischer vs. Fine, New York, 1963. Let's take a look. So black played 7dxc3, queen b3, again doubling up on the belly button, queen e7, adding an extra defender to f7, knight takes c3, white now has 4 pieces developed, and knight f6, so does black. Knight d5, advancing the knight to where it threatens both the queen on e7 and black's knight on f6. Reuben Fine plays knight takes d5, 11 exd5, now black's knight must move, and Reuben Fine wisely moves it to knight e5. Bobby Fischer responds with knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and rook e1 won't work here because there still is a bishop hanging out on a5, so Bobby Fischer plays 13, bishop b2. Big time threat on black's queen. And now 13, queen g5, saving the queen and also defending the pawn on g7 from the bishop on b2. So Bobby Fischer wants to remove that guard so he can play maybe bishop takes g7. So he does. h4, queen takes h4, bishop takes g7, rook g8, rook f to e1, Chakaruski, king d8. And now Bobby Fischer is very close to checkmating Black's king. If he could play bishop f6 check safely, that's checkmate. But Reuben Fine has a queen on h4 stopping this. So Fischer just needs to remove that guard so that he can play bishop f6 checkmate. A very similar situation occurred in the famous Danish gambit masterpiece Hans Linden versus Ladislas Mikzuski, 1863, which I'm sure Bobby Fischer studied. So I will give you 30 seconds right now to see if you can guess Bobby Fischer's move. Again, he wants to remove the guard from h4. (17) Queen g3. Reuben Fine resigns as he has no way to avoid being checkmated. Go ahead and try on your own. And again, this is from Bobby Fischer versus Reuben Fine, New York, 1963. And this is a game that every fan of the Evans Gambit should know. And now, back to the Evergreen Game. Remember, Adolf Anderssen had castled out of the pin. And Jean Dufresne doesn't play dxc3 like Reuben Fine did a century later. Instead, he plays the clever d3 push. And again, we see this motif of stacking the queen and bishop into a battery, threatening f7. Jean Dufresne plays queen f6, developing the queen onto a dangerous diagonal while providing a much-needed defender for f7. Anderssen plays 9e5, threatening the guard. Black cannot capture the pawn because his uncastled king would allow white to pin and win the knight with rook e1, and that leads to trouble. For instance, knight takes e5, rook e1, and there's that horrible pin. And black really can't do anything to avoid losing the knight since white now has two attackers on it. But what's this I hear? Why wouldn't black just be able to add another defender with 10d6? Well, then white could just pick up a free bishop with queen b5 check, forking the king and bishop on a5. But I'm sure Anderssen would have actually played bishop g5, which is an even more brutal punishment. For instance, bishop g5 threatening the queen. Where does the queen go? Well, perhaps queen g6. No, because then knight takes e5's already threatening the queen, dx e5. Rook takes e5 check. Bishop e6 blocks the check. Queen takes b7. Rook to d8, saving the rook. But then bishop b5 check. King f8. Bishop takes d8, so the rook falls anyway. Queen h6, eyeing the c1 square. But white can defend against checkmate by interposing with the bishop. And the best black can do is queen takes g5, queen b8 check, king e7, and then rook takes g5. Now, alternatively, in this variation, black could have also tried queen f5 as a safe square for the queen. But then knight takes e5, dx e5, queen b5 check, c6, rook takes e5, check, knight e7, blocking the check, rook takes e7, check, king f8, and then queen takes f5. So no, black could not play 9, knight takes e5. And while I'm on the subject of some of these interesting variations, Adolf Anderssen actually varied his play with 9 e5. After 8 queen f6, 3 years later he played rook e1 as a response. And then black can play knight g to e7, creating a pathway to castling, but did not. So apparently Jean Dufresne doesn't like to castle so much against his teacher, because instead of playing 9 knight g to e7 to create that pathway, in another game against Adolf Anderssen, he played 9 bishop e6. And then Anderssen played e5. Queen g6, queen d1, knight h6, bishop takes d3, threatening the queen again, queen h5, h3, knight to e7, knight b to d2, d5, ex d6 en passant, cx d6, 16, knight c4, bishop c5, bishop g5, f6, knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, bishop b5, check, king f8, queen takes d6, knight f5, queen d8 check, king f7, rook takes e7 check, knight takes e7, knight e5 check, exclaim. And that was the final move in Adolf Anderssen versus Jean Dufresne, also played in Berlin, but 3 years after the game I'm showing you right now. But back to the Evergreen Game. 8 queen f6, 9 e5 is what Adolf Anderssen played, which again threatens the guard, and black cannot capture the pawn. Jean Dufresne plays queen g6, saving the queen while still defending f7 and d3. Queen f5 was also a possibility. And in fact, let's take a look at that possibility real fast. Again, defending f7 and d3. White could play bishop a3. Then black could create a path for castling with knight g to e7. Knight d4, threatening the queen, queen h5, knight takes c6, knight takes c6, knight d2, bishop b6, rook a to e1, pawn to a5 was an interesting choice by black. Knight e4, now the knight's in checking distance. Knight takes e5, knight d6 check. That's what we mean by checking distance. Cx d6, queen takes b6, castle, queen takes d6, knight went to g6, 19, bishop takes d3, rook d8, bishop takes g6, queen g5, queen c7, hx g6, and bishop e7 fork was how the game Arno Eskelinen versus Jukka Tappinen, played in Finland, 1989, was won by white. But back to our main game, the Evergreen Game. Jean Dufresne has just played 9 queen g6, and Adolf Anderssen plays 10 rook e1. White's attack is already so powerful that he has 3 strong choices. For instance, he also could have played 10 bishop a3, then knight g to e7, knight d4, bishop e6, knight d2, bishop takes d4, bishop takes e7, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, knight takes e7, bishop takes d3, threatening the queen, queen c6, queen a3, threatening the knight, so queen e6 defending, so black can hopefully castle, bishop c4, threatening the queen again, d5, ex d6 en passant, queen takes d6, queen goes to f3, threatening the belly button twice, but black can castle now. Knight goes to e4, again moving the knight into what I like to refer to as checking distance. Black's queen goes to g6, rook f to e1, bishop g4, queen goes to f4, knight c6, queen takes c7, rook a to c8, queen goes back to d6, bishop f5, threatening the knight twice, queen f4, defending it a second time, knight b4, 26, knight d6, a very pretty fork. But black has bishop h3, threatening checkmate, g3 stops the mate, knight c2, another fork, knight takes c8, bishop takes c8, black's knight still forking white's rooks, rook e7, and then bishop e6. leaves white enough material ahead that black resigned in Franz Kuipers versus Rudiger von Saldern, played in 2002. The other choice, instead of rook e1, would have been 10 rook d1. And let's take a quick look at that real fast. After all, this is the Evergreen Game, so we'll be taking a little bit of extra time to look at the Evergreen branches. Knight g to e7, again, making that pathway toward castling. Bishop takes d3, threatening the queen. Queen h5, knight b to d2, castle. Bishop a3. We're seeing whites and blacks pieces moving to the same squares in a lot of these variations. And if you've noticed that, you're noticing, actually, that there are themes to this opening. So good on you for picking up on those themes. d6, ex d6, cx d6, bishop takes d6, rook d8, knight c4, defending the bishop, bishop e6, pinning the knight to the queen, queen a3, stepping out, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight f5, bishop f4, queen g4, bishop takes f7, check. King takes f7, queen b3, check. King f8, knight g5, knight h6, knight takes h7, check. King e8, rook e1, check. Knight e7, rook takes e7, check. King takes e7, and rook e1, check. Forced black to resign in Chongsheng Zheng versus Yunguo Wang, played in Beijing 2012. So those were the other two choices that Adolf Anderssen had on move 10, and I'm sure he considered both of those. But back to what he chose, which is 10 rook e1, a fine move. 10 knight g to e7, and again, this is creating that pathway to castle. Why black doesn't get castled in this game is a question I would love to ask Jean Dufresne, but unfortunately this game was played in 1852, so I'll never get the opportunity. 11 bishop a3 is what Adolf Anderssen chose, and the bishop on a3 is on a nice diagonal for white, whether black castles or not. Certainly, if you were considering, say, 11 knight b to d2, that would also be fine. And I have a nice game where that was played as well. Black castled, knight to e4, again moving the knight into checking distance, d5, ex d6, en passant cx d6, bishop takes d3, again placing the bishop on the same diagonal as the queen. Pawn to d5, knight c5, queen h5. There goes the queen back out to h5 again. Bishop g5, knight g6, bishop d2, bishop b6. Queen goes to b5, bishop g4, knight goes to g5, h6, h3, hx g5, hx g4. Queen's got to take that pawn. Queen takes g4, bishop e2, threatening the queen, queen f5, bishop d3, threatening the queen again, queen f6, bishop e3. And black moves their knight to e5, a very useful square for that knight. Bishop e2, rook f to e8, rook a to d1, getting the rooks involved, rook a to d8. Queen drops back to b3, knight a5, threatening the queen. Queen goes up to b5, queen c6. Will white trade queens? No. They play bishop d4 first, knight e to c4. Then queen goes to b4. And black plays knight d6. And that was how Stuart Conquest defeated Mark Narcisco Dublin in Pamplona 2002. But back to our main Evergreen game. White has just played 11 bishop a3. And right here, we've got to be thinking about castling if we're black. It's the perfect opportunity. I know it's a little uncomfortable to castle into that pin, but that little bit of uncomfort for your knight on e7 is easily eclipsed by the extra comfort your king will have being secure on g8. But Jean Dufresne plays 11 b5. Now this I have to consider a mistake. But I also have to respect the creativity that Jean Dufresne is displaying here. This pawn to b5, as we will see in later variations of this game, actually does not cause Jean Dufresne to lose in the Evergreen game. Surely castling makes better sense, all things considered. But instead of castling, Jean Dufresne decided to play this 11b5 move, which sacrifices a pawn to allow his rook and bishop to enter into battle quickly. Again, I think this plan is overly aggressive, and better plans would involve castling, and I'll show you a couple of those right now. But sacrificing a pawn with 11b5 was an extremely creative attempt to gain some attacking momentum for black, and had Jean Dufresne not played this move, certainly we wouldn't have the rest of the brilliant game to look through 170 years later. Now, for the students of chess, which we all are, what would I suggest here instead of this brilliantly interesting slight mistake, 11b5? Simply 11 castle is fine. White can play 12 rook d1, preparing bishop takes d3, but black has an interesting move here, and that is to just scoot the pawn forward. It's going to die anyways. So scoot the pawn forward. Don't let white take it with initiative. So instead, then white would take it with their undeveloped knight, surely. Then black could play d6, ex d6, cx d6, bishop e2 maybe, and bishop e6, developing with the threat against the queen. And that seems fine for black. The other idea involving castling would be playing d5 right away. Then after ex d6, en passant, cx d6, knight b to d2, and then black can castle. So two easy to play lines that would get black's king safe, and then black can worry about creating counterplay. Instead, Jean Dufresne played 11b5. Queen takes b5 is the obvious response, and that's what Adolf Anderssen plays. 12 rook b8, and now Dufresne gets a rook into the b file with initiative. However, how valuable is the open file when white is already castled and black's pieces aren't in position to help the rook? That's a rhetorical question. 13, queen a4. Bishop b6. Dufresne places the bishop onto the same diagonal as white's king instead of castling, because castling here would be a disaster. For instance, if 13 castle, the knight on c6 would be overworked trying to defend both the bishop on a5 and knight on e7. So 14, bishop takes e7, and black must decide between defending the bishop on a5 or capturing back, and thus will lose a piece. So Dufresne played 13 b6, not castling, but at least this time he shouldn't have castled. 14, knight b to d2. Anderssen completes his development, which makes sense. However, I believe slightly better could be 14, queen to d1, because then after black castles, you get to play bishop takes d3, threatening their queen right away. They could certainly interpose with the pawn, f5, and then instead of taking on passant right away, then we could complete the castling process. And white definitely has better piece organization and better threats. So in response to 14, knight b to d2, Jean Dufresne plays 14, bishop b7, a purely offensive move. And Dufresne now looks poised to wreak havoc with his bishops and queen. However, developing the bishop to b7 is again not castling, and black really needs to castle. For instance, if black plays move 14 castle, it would take a lot of pressure off black's king and would allow Dufresne much better chances against his teacher. Years ago, I played through this exact variation with a class of talented chess students, and we continued with knight e4, d5, ex d6, en passant, cx d6, bishop takes d3, putting the bishop on the same diagonal as the queen, bishop g4, knight takes d6, queen takes d3, queen takes g4, queen takes c3, knight f5, knight takes f5, bishop takes f8, queen b2, king h1, Bishop takes f2, rook e to c1, g6, queen to e4, rook takes f8, queen takes c6, bishop b6, queen c3, queen takes c3, rook takes c3, and rook d8. White still has an edge, but I was able to continue to a draw playing black against my class in this game. So that's some good food for thought. But back to that very aggressive, purely offensive 14 bishop b7. White responds, and I really like this move by Anderson. He plays 15 knight e4. It's a beautiful move. Knight e4 moves a knight into checking range and blocks black's queen from defending the d3 pawn. Furthermore, it sticks an extra knight in between the bishop and queen intersecting on g2. So all in all, just a really pretty move. Black plays queen f5. And as much as I respect 15 knight e4, I have that much disregard for 15 queen f5. Because Dufresne places his queen to where it is pinning white's knight on f3, which seems like a good plan. However, all you have to do is analyze white's checks, captures, and threats, and you'll notice that Anderson will surely play bishop takes d3, which will force black to again move the queen. Therefore, Dufresne's 15 queen f5 is at best a loss of tempo for black. I like Lasker's suggested improvement, which is 15 d2. Let's take a look at it real fast. 15 d2. Here, black is giving up his d-pawn on his own terms. What do I mean by that? White's going to have to put a knight in reverse to capture the pawn. So after knight ex d2, white spends a tempo, again moving the knight in reverse, which in turn gives black time to castle safely. Excellent suggestion from Dr. Lasker. But Jean Dufresne played the poorly thought out 15 queen f5, which of course allows bishop takes d3. And now Dufresne cannot castle, because if he chooses to castle, boom, knight f6, and he'll lose his queen. So after bishop takes d3, Jean Dufresne plays 16 queen h5, as he was forced to move his queen again to make up for his last mistake. However, he can't make up for the loss of tempi. His queen f5 move cost him. 17 knight f6 check. The most beautiful inaccuracy of the game. Objectively speaking, rook a to d1, bishop c2, or the very natural knight g3 were all better moves. And maybe Anderson would have chosen one of those options had he been playing against, I don't know, Staunton or Morphy. However, he's playing against his student, and the temptation to play such a beautiful move is hard to resist in such circumstances. For that matter, had Anderson chosen to play more scientifically here, we wouldn't be discussing his artistic masterpiece 170 years later on Master Chess Theater. 17 gx f6. Dufresne must play this to avoid losing his queen. 18 ex f6. And now Anderson's enterprising knight sacrifice has opened the e-file, punishing Dufresne for not castling because white's rook on e1 is perfectly placed. 18 rook g8. Dufresne responds by placing his rook into the same file as white's king, which pins the g2 pawn and creates a lot of threats for black. 19 rook a to d1. Anderson's tactical vision is remarkable. Foreseeing that his rook should be on d1 to team up with the queen on d7 is chess genius at the highest level. And of course, such a brilliant chess player would never play 19 fx e7 instead, because if 19 fx e7, white's own pawn on e7 becomes the perfect shield for black's king, and black would win by force. Queen takes f3, threatening mate on g2. Bishop e4 stops the mate and threatens black's queen, but rook takes g2 check, king h1, knight e5, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now black's bishop can deliver checkmate when his rook reverses off of g2. Queen f4, so queen f4 allows the queen to capture the bishop on f3 and prevent the mate. Rook takes f2 check, queen takes f3, knight takes f3. And now black is threatening checkmate with rook takes h2. Bishop d6 can defend h2 for a second time, but just for a moment. Cx d6, rook e2, and same with rook e2. Rook takes e2. And now white is out of defenses. So rook h2, checkmate. So Anderson had two good reasons not to play 19 fx e7. One was that his pawn would in fact shield black's king, and the second was he would lose by force. So he played 19 rook a to d1, 19 queen takes f3, the key mistake at the key moment in the game. I could probably write an entire book on the complexities of black's alternatives here. For right now, I'll go ahead and show you the remainder of the actual game, and we'll come back to what Jean Dufresne could have played instead to avoid losing after this move. Rook takes e7 check. Jean Dufresne cannot play queen takes g2 mate because he is in fact in check himself. So knight takes e7, setting up one of the most beautiful combinations ever played, and I don't say that lightly. White to move and mate in 4. Go ahead and pause the video to look for the mating combination. Once you think you have it, unpause and see what happens next. Did you spot 21 queen takes d7 check? I know I didn't the first time I played through this game. Absolutely stunning. One of the most brilliant mating combinations ever played in the history of chess. Black, of course, needs to play king takes d7, and because if they go king f8, then either bishop takes e7 or queen takes e7 is checkmate. So Dufresne played 21 king takes d7, bishop f5, double check. The black king must move because it is a double check. King goes back to e8 because if king c6, we have this really pretty checkmate coming from the backside, bishop d7. So Dufresne played 22 king e8, 23 bishop d7 check. And now black has only two choices. He could play king d8, and then bishop takes e7 checkmate, or, as in the game, he could play king f8. And still, bishop takes e7 is checkmate. So, in fact, to avoid this beautiful mate in 4, I guess we would have to go back to, say, move 20. After rook takes e7 check, Dufresne could have played 20 king d8, but then that's not very good either. Rook takes d7, king c8. Rook d8 check, king takes d8, bishop e4 check, gonna lose the queen. Knight d4, bishop takes f3, and bishop takes f3. It's painful, but I guess preferable to being checkmated in 4 moves. But again, I'm glad Jean Dufresne didn't, because then we wouldn't have had one of the most beautiful mating combinations ever played in chess. Now, I promised you guys that I would go back to move 19 and show you other options for Jean Dufresne where he wouldn't have lost by force. In fact, he probably could have walked away with a draw against his master teacher. So again, the key mistake for Dufresne was playing 19 queen takes f3. Here I want you to pause the video again, get something to write with, and find alternatives for black. Can you find a better move? Once you have, unpause and see if your move was correct. Let's look at some of the possibilities for black. Did you come up with 19 queen g4? If you did, it's a terrible mistake, because after queen takes g4, rook takes g4, bishop f5, threatening the rook, rook f4, bishop takes d7 check, king f8, fx e7 check, knight takes e7, bishop takes e7 check, king g7, knight d4, rook e4, knight f5 check, king g8, bishop f6, bishop c5, h3, bishop d5, rook takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight h6, check, king f8, bishop f5, bishop takes f5, and knight takes f5. White would easily win. 19 queen g4 doesn't work. Likewise, 19 knight b4 is a humongous mistake. In fact, white has a mate in 4, similar to the one played in the actual game. Queen takes d7, king takes d7, bishop b5, check, king c8, bishop d7, king d8, and this time fx e7, checkmate. 19 knight e5 is interesting. Black could get a lot of checks. Let's look at it. 19 knight e5, rook takes e5, rook takes g2 check, king f1, bishop takes f3. Black's getting some pressure here. Rook takes h5, but at the expense of a queen. Bishop c6, queen b4, rook takes f2 check, king e1, d6, rook takes h7, rook takes f6, rook h8 check, king d7, rook takes b8, rook e6 check, and king d2. And white has a big material advantage and would certainly be able to win from here. A couple years ago when I was teaching this game, a student came up with 19 rook takes g2 check. It's a very tempting move that certainly gives white plenty of opportunities to blunder. However, it's just not accurate enough to be a legitimate alternative. Because after king takes g2, knight e5, queen takes d7 check, there's that queen sacrifice again. King takes d7, bishop g6, check, king e6, bishop takes h5, winning the queen back, rook g8, check, king h3, knight g6, bishop g4, check, king takes f6, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop e7, check, king takes e7, rook takes e5, check, king f6, and rook f5. Black did a little better than the last couple of variations we examined, but certainly white should go on to win from here. Another possibility suggested by another student, of course, when I teach this game in a real-world lecture, I instruct my students to also pull out a pencil and paper and write their best suggestions and then send them forward, and we go through them all on the board. So a while back, one of these students suggested 19d6 as a means of interfering with the scope of the dangerous a3 bishop. This may be true, but white will still get a winning game. 20 bishop e4, king f8, fx e7 check, knight takes e7, bishop takes b7, queen g6, knight h4, threatening the queen, queen f6, bishop f3, turning the bishop to safety, knight g6, knight takes g6, hx g6, rook e2, rook h8, queen c6, king g7, h3, rook to h4, and 29 bishop g4, white has a winning material advantage. So now that we've looked at the moves that don't work, but are interesting suggestions, let's look at two moves that actually do work. First, we'll look at the famous queen maneuver line that has been mentioned in several books, as well as several other fine YouTube videos on this Evergreen game. And that maneuver starts with queen h3, 19 queen h3. It's a resourceful move that threatens to checkmate while defending the d7 pawn. So let's see why this idea works. Well, first, white has to play bishop f1 to defend against checkmate. g3 simply doesn't work. After rook takes g3, check, hx g3, queen takes g3, king h1, queen takes f3, check, king h2, and knight e5, it is white who is in a ton of trouble here. The most immediate threat being queen g2 checkmate, of course. So queen takes d7, white can sack the queen to steal the initiative, king takes d7, 25 bishop e2 check. So a couple tactics later, black is in trouble. This is what we call a sharp position. Black could play 25 knight d5, moving the knight out of death's grip to block the check. 26 bishop takes f3, because white, of course, needs to take the queen. But now black can capture that bishop with check. Knight takes f3, check. King g3, knight takes e1. 28 c4. White can use their free move to add pressure to the pin, but rook g8, check. Another rook enters the fight with a check. King h4, bishop takes f2, check. King h5, rook g3, rook takes d5 check, bishop takes d5, cx d5, rook takes a3, and white is dead in the water. But remember, after the brilliant 19 queen h3 resource, white wouldn't be forced to play g3 at all. Remember, bishop f1 is the move they must play to stop checkmate. And then black can play 20 queen f5. From here, the black queen is still defending d7 and is threatening to capture the dangerous f6 pawn. 21 king h1. White can step out of the dangerous g-file, and this, after many precise moves from both sides, will lead to a draw. Alternatively, now that there is no threat of queen takes g2 checkmate, white can bring the bishop out to d3 and also achieve a draw. So we'll continue with the king h1 idea first. Black can play queen takes f6, removing that dangerous pawn and achieving an equal position with lots of interesting possibilities. 22 bishop takes e7, knight takes e7 is forced, rook takes d7, king f5, black must move the king off of the diagonal with white's queen immediately. Rook e takes e7, white has two rooks in the 7th, but 24 queen takes f3, black has some serious plans of his own. 25 gx f3, bishop takes f3, bishop g2, bishop takes g2 check, king g1, bishop h3, check, king h1, and bishop g2 check is another obvious drawing line. But back to the check fork. 25 rook takes f7 check, queen takes f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7, queen f4 check, king e7, queen e5 check, king d8, queen f6 check, king d7. And again, the position is equal, but I prefer white with the queen and black's king exposed. Queen f5 check, king d6, queen f4 check, king c6, queen f3 check, king d7, queen f5 check. But as it turns out, white cannot make progress, and this is just a draw. So going back to our notes, after 19 queen h3, white must play bishop f1, to which black can play that neat maneuver, queen f5. And I told you that here, instead of king h1, stepping out of the dangerous g-file, white could actually, since there's no longer a threat of mate on g2, white could actually play bishop d3, attacking the queen again. To which, if Dufresne wanted to get a draw with his famous chess teacher, and I think he probably would, he could return queen h3, and then the bishop has to go back to f1, right? Queen goes back to f5, bishop could go back to d3, and he could get a draw by repetition. Or, if for some reason, after the bishop's attacking the queen, he doesn't want the draw by repetition, he could play 21 queen takes f6 and simply remove that dangerous f6 pawn, creating a roughly equal position, again with a lot of interesting possibilities, such as 22 bishop e4. Certainly Anderson would have contested control of the diagonal of concern. Then rook g4, pinning the bishop to the queen. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and we have a very explosive position. This is, in fact, one of my favorite what-ifs from the game. Rook takes d7. I said it was explosive. In fact, the position was explosive enough to produce spectacular combinations like this. Rook takes e4, rook takes e7, check, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, check, king takes e7, queen h4, check, and this fork guarantees that the material will be even. However, black's king is more exposed, and white's pieces would be easier to coordinate, so I would prefer white in this roughly even position. Therefore, it's probably best for black to have instigated the earlier mentioned draw by repetition. So we just concluded looking at the main refutation to Adolf Anderson's attack as suggested by many chess teachers. Now I'm going to show you something that I have not seen mentioned anywhere else that is a really clever, brilliant alternative to the main refutation. So alternatively, I am really quite fond of 19 bishop d4. This is a really cool looking move that again threatens to capture the dangerous pawn on f6. Moreover, if white captures the bishop, he will have to settle for a draw. Let's break it down. So if cx d4, now white's pawn on d4 shields black's d7 pawn from white's rook on d1. Remember, in the conclusion to the game, it was the queen sacrifice on d7 that set up a discovered check using the rook on d1. So if there's a pawn on d4 blocking that rook, that really fantastic mating combination at the end of this game would never occur. So after 20 cx d4, then queen takes f3 is perfectly safe to play. Bishop e4, rook takes g2 check, king h1, rook takes h2 check, king h2, queen takes f2 check, king h1, queen h4 check, king g1, queen g4 check, king h1, queen h4 check, king g1, queen g4 check, and we have a draw in the making. Quickly returning to the really cool bishop d4 idea, white could also capture it with knight takes d4, which avoids the issue of clogging the d file with a pawn on d4, but now black has the ability to play a really cool sacrifice. Rook takes g2 check, stealing the initiative, king takes g2, knight takes d4 check. Remember, a discovered check is still a check. Rook e4 to stop the queen from playing g4, because if white plays the natural bishop e4, black has 22 queen g4 check, king f1, queen h3 check, king g1, bishop takes e4 threatening mate, f3, knight takes f3 check, king f2, queen h4 check, king e2, knight e5, rook f1, bishop f3 check, rook takes f3, and queen takes a4. There goes the queen, and any chances for white. So black has to play 22 rook e4 to stop the queen from playing queen g4 check. But, of course, now black can take the rook with check, and should. Then 23, bishop takes e4, queen g4 check. But I suppose, at least in this line, white convinced his opponent to part ways with their light squared bishop, so they're better off. It won't end in a checkmating combination. King f1, queen e2 check, king g1, queen takes e4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, knight g6, and black would have even material with a better pawn structure. So again, the queen h3 improvement is relatively famous and very well tested. My bishop d4 move is my own personal discovery and contribution to the theory of the Evergreen Game, and should also prove to be an accurate move by black. But let's look at what actually happened one last time. One of the most beautiful checkmating combinations ever played in the history of chess. Dufresne plays queen takes f3. And honestly, if I was sitting at a chessboard, I would play that move all day long as well. These corrections were aided by years and years of study, and more recently being analyzed by computers. When you're sitting at the board and you can take a knight and threaten what looks to be checkmate, I think it is only human to play queen takes f3. And then this is why the Evergreen Game is so beautiful. That was an absolutely understandable mistake by Dufresne, and then rook takes e7 check, forcing knight takes e7. And then queen takes d7, sacrificing the queen. And then bishop f5 double check. And then king e8. Bishop d7 check. King f8. And bishop takes e7 checkmate. I really hope you enjoyed my presentation today of the Evergreen Game. Adolf Anderssen's masterpiece versus Jean Dufresne, played in Berlin, Germany in 1852. And if you enjoyed this game, all my notes are freely available on dailychessmusings.com, as well as a quiz on this episode. I encourage you to play through it and study and play through as many what-ifs as you can think of. Maybe you'll make your own discovery in this evergreen game. This has been an episode of Master Chess Theater, a production of Daily Chess Musings. My name is Chris Torres. Please remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.